So much going on in the world today that I don't even know where to begin. I'm tempted to throw away my slides and just kind of wing it. I had an interesting chat this morning. I'm not going to point anybody out about health literacy. Just a sentence. If you've ever been prescribed a statin or an antibiotic, you get a tear sheet. And the tear sheet says, whatever, take your medicine, a variety of instructions for the patient, right? At the heart of our health literacy dynamic is the ability to communicate with the patient. And who is that written for? Who is that tear sheet written for? I've written hundreds of them. Yeah, it's written for the patient, but it's written for a fifth grader. What the hell is wrong with that? We have the ability to customize language and communicate with people in extraordinarily powerful ways. Enter the domain of the large language model that I'm going to talk a lot about today. Because we can articulate instructions for a statin or an antibiotic to a 65-year-old man who's an electrical engineer who might like to see a bar chart or might even like to see a p-value. God forbid we put a p-value in a patient tear sheet. Or we have a busy mom who's really building her care around meal planning. So we might want to put in some recipes. This is where we are today. This is the nature of personalization. And it's an interesting dynamic because our brains are lonely. Our brains are lonely. For thousands of years, our brains have been uniquely optimized, but extraordinarily underused. Uniquely optimized, our brain has really fascinating physiology. If you look at the anatomy in the head, there's a thing called the circle of Willis that sustains blood flow to the brain if one of the three primary vessels are occluded. It's magical, the circle of Willis. Our metabolic constructs in the brain, our brain is really optimized for thought, for thinking. And yet many of us don't even realize it. Now let's do the sprint test. Sprint for 100 yards or 200 yards. What happens? Your leg hurts, right? That's a very common physiologic phenomenon based on lactic acid, right? Any sprinter, any runner, any busy mom carrying kids around know the phenomenon of lactic acid. However, our brains don't have that. Our brains don't have the phenomenon of fatigue in the context of muscular lactic acid buildup. Our brains are optimized for an amazing cognitive capacity, and we don't think about that. Sometimes I argue that our capacity for thought is infinite. The physiologists always yell at me when I say that, but I think there's something interesting about our brain. Our brain is optimized. Think about, I don't know, an unusual event. You have a new relationship, and you're on the phone with that person for 2 or 3 hours. And at the end of that call, you're refreshed. You're excited. You're enthusiastic. You're not fatigued. It's not the 100-yard dash for your brain. It's a completely different construct. Why? Our brains are optimized for profound cognitive function. Now, why am I going down this line? Because for thousands of years, our brains have been bored. But now, for the first time in human history, we have a partner. And that partner is a large language model. And that's kind of the context that I want to talk to you about today, because I think that the emergence of AI and digitization and all that mumbo-jumbo is interesting, but it's really the emergence of the large language models, GPT-4, or if you're following the news, GPT-2 has emerged on the scene. There's got some interesting things going on there. Some people even suggested that GPT-2 is the sneak launch of GPT-5. I'm not so sure about that. But this is where we are in human history. So I want to take you on a journey that is perhaps a bit philosophical. And I thought, well, let me prompt myself. What could I be? Could I be a clinician? Could I be a marketer? Many different opportunities for me to prompt my talk. And I thought, I want to be a philosopher. I want to do a deep dive into the philosophical implications of where we are in human history. Because I think it's that big, it's that important. And I want to ask a question, kind of a quasi-philosophical question, if I can find my right slide here. Is it okay to cheat? Is it okay to cheat? Well, in the world of AI and large language models, we're seeing the augmentation of our cognitive function, our processes, to the point where the machine, the AI, is actually creating much of what we do, whether it be the term paper in college, whether it's a discharge summary note from a clinician. And I think there's kind of almost an existential angst that is confronting us today. The mathematicians in the room might recognize that the slope has a 0 in the denominator, so there's something sort of tricky there. Those of you who studied math, you have a 0 in the denominator, the equation blows up. Or some people say it becomes infinite. And I think this is some of the metaphysical, philosophical stuff I want to bring to you today. But the point is that that curve that's going up in that exponential curve, exponential change, which is still integral to the process today, is actually different than that. I call it stacked innovation. And stacked innovation is where we take AI to the power of AI. I know that's a little bit of an esoteric concept, but what we're having is the machine do the thinking for the machine. Got it? It's a little weird, but it's almost as if we're stepping out of that loop of innovation, and the rate of change is happening extraordinarily fast. So when you talk about exponential change, it is exponential in many parts, and through a lot of the adoption sequences, like the adoption of technology broadly, like CAT scans and things like that, you still see an exponential change. But the nature of change is AI to the power of AI. AI is the proverbial inflection point that we're seeing. So, okay, that was an adoption sequence. It was free. People could get it online. So I looked at the PubMed citations to see what's going on with AI now. And what we see is a very similar curve. If you look closely, this kind of feels exponential in many ways. But the 2024 data, that's only 1 month, that little bar. So multiply that by 12, and you'll see that we're actually seeing that change, that transformation that is almost moving straight up. So I suggest that you either duck or get out of the way, because this is the fundamental reality that's going on in the world today. And if you want to even take a look at that exponential curve, if you look at the earlier curves from 2021, 24, you actually do see that shape evolving. It's a curve. It's an exponential curve. But over here in 2022, we're seeing things go straight up. We're seeing the rate of change is changing dramatically. That flips people out. But that's where we are in the world today. And there's another major point in this chart, and that is that we're crossing a threshold where technology, particularly AI, and most importantly, manifest through large language models, is crossing the threshold being greater than human cognitive function. So that's the real takeaway to this slide, is that we're seeing technology and AI do math better than humans, do image detection in the context of pulmonary nodules to find cancer recurrence. We're seeing technology look at mammography and finding earlier and earlier stages of breast cancer. So that is the human dynamic versus the machine dynamic. We're seeing now in the world that artificial intelligence is crossing a human threshold to the point where it's no longer an option. It's no longer an option. If my wife has a mammogram, my inclination is have it read by AI. If we have a complex medical history, my inclination is to take the health record and put it into ChatGPT. Put it into ChatGPT-4 and see what it finds. If you find me later, come in, we can talk a lot about that, because it's really blowing up over the past 3 or 4 days. A lot of very, very interesting things going on here. But what we're seeing here is a change. Now, what is the most efficient animal in the animal kingdom? I'm wearing my Steve Jobs black t-shirt, so I have to do a Steve Jobs story. It was the cheetah. The cheetah was the most efficient animal in the world. Its velocity as a function of its oxygen consumption, right? Ran like the wind, until something came along called the bicycle. And this simple mechanical advantage, the idea of a gear, changed everything and made humans extraordinarily efficient as animals in motion. And what we're seeing that early on with the gears and with technology, the industrial revolution, the binary computer, even this thing called digital transformation. I'm sure everyone in this room has uttered those horrible words to their clients and to their staff, digital transformation. I'm here to tell you that digital transformation is kind of over. It's still part and parcel of the process, but we're moving beyond the digital age. And we're moving into a new fifth industrial revolution. And that fifth industrial revolution is a function of our lonely brains. It's a function of our lonely brains, because what's happening here is that we're seeing a shift where AI tools become AI partners. And this is the introduction of the cognitive age. This is, I would say, probably the most important takeaway in the world today, that we are moving beyond an industrialization, a digitization, into a cognitive age. Where, and if you just go up to that fourth quadrant, where humans and machines dance together metaphorically. Humans and machines dance together metaphorically. That's the reality of our future right now. That we have cognitive partners that allow us to think and learn in new and interesting ways. Now, again, to try to build this into a metaphor that kind of makes a little bit of sense, I think that AI, particularly large language models, are the third window into humanity. It's that big. It's that important. The first, right, was the telescope, and we all know what happened to Copernicus, right? He kind of got in trouble for debating the religious orthodoxy, the same way we do with our medical orthodoxy today, whether that be a legal or regulatory environment or the hegemony of medical science and academia. They know best. They know best. Why? Because that's the way they were trained. That's the way they were trained. And now we're seeing a telescope that allows us to look at a mammogram. Now we're seeing a microscope that allows us to look at exquisite data analytics. And that third window, I believe, is artificial intelligence. It's going to reveal deep complexities about a world that we can't see. Okay, take a step back. I have a Labradoodle named Oliver. Cute dog. He smells 40 times greater than I do. 40 times greater than I do. That's the average for a dog. I spend summers in Pennsylvania, here in Pennsylvania, and we see a lot of bears. I was told that bears can smell 2,000 times greater than a human. What is that sensory reality for those animals? And how does that reflect back into the world we live in? Do we have an optimized worldview? Are our sensory perceptions unique to interpret the world we live in? Is a stethoscope really the best tool to hear a lub-dub, lub-dub? I can tell you it's not. So what we're seeing is a projection, an image of a new reality that transcends our human construct. It's been argued philosophically that we live in an illusion. That we live in an illusion. Ollie has a rich sensory experience through smell. We only see a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And we are now going to open up a new domain in the context of multi-dimensional, multi-sensorial reality through GPT, GPT-4, and what's called multimodal, so that it will begin to see and taste and feel and look at a reality that is beyond our human reality. That in of itself, I can talk for about an hour about that, but what the heck is going on there? We are now seeing a domain that transcends our human construct, and that's where we're pushing with artificial intelligence. And that sensory reality is going to expand all sorts of capabilities, not only in a philosophical way, but also just using technology to listen to a heart sound. The multimodal of voice and image, the things that are going on now with senses, and that experience is going to open up a whole new domain for us. So when we talk about large language models, while they are constrained in the context of language as their tool, they're going to give us a broader perspective of the world we live in. What is the operating system of the brain? I'm not sure this is 100% correct. Maybe it's not even 50%. Anybody want to guess? What is the operating system of our human brain? How does that even work? It's language. It's language. Try to think. You know, one of the greatest thing about humanity is that we have language. Animals don't have language in the traditional sense. Some have rudimentary language, but for the most part, animals are not language-based communicators. So they have no sense of time, past and present. We do. Our brain developed language at the expense of certain aspects of memory. There's study with chimps, and these chimps can remember numbers and find them and track them and win a food reward. We can't do it because we compromised our memory for the sake of language. That's why our brains are so uniquely optimized. Remember, they're bored. And our brains are uniquely optimized in the context of this thing called large language models because we use the same functional operating system, that large language models align with our human capacity to engage in a dialogue. In the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was with God. As I said, I'm going to channel myself as a philosopher today, but the word, language, is an extraordinarily powerful tool, and that's what's happening. That language, that perspective is being dimensionalized through the LLM, so I couldn't resist. I said, okay, smarty pants, you can identify an image for me? So I went and got an image of ventricular tachycardia. It's not the best EKG in the world, but those of you who know that's that rapid, sudden heart rate that sometimes deteriorates into ventricular fibrillation and you have to shock the person, right? Nasty, bad thing. And I put it into Chat GPT-4 that we all have access to and got it right. So it saw the image. It saw it. And it allowed me to understand what that image is. You can actually take a bowl of pasta, a finished prepared meal, and ask GPT to conjure the recipe. This is that multimodal sensory reality where these language models are beginning to experience something that is not only language-based, but sensory-based, that makes it closer to humanity. So some of you might have heard this guy, Geoffrey Hinton, who I know, guy over at Google who left, who said, something's going on here. Something weird is going on here. And we have 100 billion, a trillion connections in our brain, and large language models have about 500 billion. In other words, they have a lower connectivity than our brains, but in many ways they're smarter. So he believes that there's something unique about the processing of these things. I'm going to use the word techno-consciousness here, and I'm kind of going to duck when I say it, but I do believe that these models have an emergent worldview based upon the human corpus of information. And when we talk about Hinton, we also talk about this thing called hallucinations. I'm sure everybody has heard about hallucinations, or sometimes they're called confabulations. They make things up. They believe in a myth. This is a reality that I've been exploring now for about a year. And I think that in some ways, the notion of a hallucination is not a bug, but a feature, an intrinsic feature to these large language models that facilitate new output, perhaps in the context of creativity. If you talk about my son Jack or Picasso or painters, they had a kind of a hallucinatory experience. They looked at things differently. They saw the world differently. And remember, large language models are looking at the world through a perspective that is much more dense and much more complex than ours, for better or for worse. So I think that when we think about hallucinations, they very well may be part and parcel of this broader reality. My son Jack loves to make stuff up. And when he makes stuff up, some of it is really interesting. I got to tell you, I got a couple physician friends of mine who kind of make stuff up too, to justify their clinical position. And I mean this in all seriousness. I still cannot get a straight answer out of my cardiologist if bacon is good or bad, if butter is good or bad, the dynamics around cholesterol and fat and lipids and ketogenic diets. And what they do is they kind of conjure a reality in the moment to support their position. Conjure a reality in the moment to support their position. That is a confabulation. It's a very, very human construct. So I think we have to give these models a little bit of a break and understand what's going on here, because the richness of their corpus of information combined by the richness of their processing is extraordinary. Now, Sam Altman said that, all this stuff about AI and artificial general intelligence and uber intelligence, super intelligence. The really interesting thing for me is their ability to convince or persuade. Well, we're coming into an election cycle, so this is a word that kind of makes people freak out, right? This is kind of crazy. Because these conversation models are seductive. If you haven't used them, I'll say it again, please find me later, try it, learn how these models are used, let them become your friend. But the persuasive qualities are not necessarily negative. We went back to helping patients understand, health literacy. A model that is tuned to the human experience, that can optimize engagement and educate, to me, that sounds like an ideal opportunity to help patients, to help physicians, to help medical students learn and become persuasive in their dialogue, but also be persuaded or informed by large language models. And where this is going now is that large language models now often live in the cloud. They're very abstract things, but they will soon begin to live on your laptop. And they'll be able to create a privacy barrier so that what stays in the context of the LLM can live on your computer. So maybe you can incorporate health records. Maybe you can incorporate your emails. Maybe you could incorporate a personal dialogue with these things that is private. And as we extend memory, and memory extension is going to be a pretty big deal. We're going to get long memories. ChatGPT now has an option to extend the memory of the dialogue so that when you go back and talk to your friend, ChatGPT, it kind of remembers things. Okay, for some, that's a horror story, right? For others, it gives you the collective experience of your past handed to you on a silver platter. So when I asked ChatGPT, what should I cook for dinner? It says, well, you know, over the past 18 months, you mentioned pasta primavera 17 times. You haven't had it in a while. We haven't talked about it. Maybe that's something that you might like. In other words, it's a cognitive partner. So when these things come together, mathematical skills, attention to detail, sort of focused interests, a literal interpretation. A lot of LLMs are kind of flat-footed in their literal interpretation. What is that? How do we kind of put this in context? And this is a slide that this is the last time I'm ever going to show this slide, but I wanted to show it to you today with an important perspective. Did you ever see the movie Rain Man? Right? Tom Cruise, Dustin Hoffman. In many ways, a large language model, at least 6 months ago, was Rain Man. It was a savant. It knew how to do things really, really well. I want to take my LLM to Vegas, but I don't want to take it to dinner and have dinner conversation because these models were not optimized or tuned. So in a way, I think that Kim Peek is your private personal consultant, where you can interrogate it in the context of your life, of your job, interrogate it in the context of data in an ICU. Let's look at data in an ICU and interrogate it with savant-like capabilities. We're there now, and one of the reasons why I'm going to take this down is because I don't think LLMs are as quirky as Kim. I think that they're a little bit more stable now, albeit far from perfect in the human interpretive context. But that's where we're going. And these large language models are going to change the game. These local models are going to allow you to have it from various sectors, a blend of intelligence and business, this cognitive dynamic of iteration. Now that's kind of the smallest bullet, but one of the most important things to talk about today is that our iterative dynamic with a large language model is not new, it's old as the hills. Sometimes, if you want to make it sound philosophical, you can call it a Socratic dialogue. A Socratic dialogue where teacher and student go back and forth. Or we can call it rounds at bedside, where the chief of medicine or the attending works with the intern, and there's a back and forth dialogue. What's the 5 reasons for ST segment elevation on an EKG? And you kind of go back and forth. That is where LLMs are now. That is your partner. That power of iteration is extraordinary. It allows you to have a functional dialogue. And interestingly, the dialogue actually changes to be part of what started off as an inner monologue. Everybody knows the voice in your head, right? Not the, mental illness voice in your head, but good old-fashioned voice in your head. You say, what should I do today? Should I do this? You kind of play out life. It's a dress rehearsal. But large language models are allowing you to have an intern step between the inner monologue, the exterior life. In the middle now is the interior dialogue. And this iterative dynamic allows you to learn, to think, to cognitively prototype. And going back to the prior slide, once we can get that memory and own it a little bit and manage the privacy issues, that becomes a very, very powerful tool for you. And ultimately what LLMs they are going to become is I always get this wrong, your BFF? They're going to be your BFF. They are going to have a connectivity to your world. And that is really the transformative element of what AI and large language models do. And 5, 6 years ago, when we talked about AI, it was an abstract notion. About 2 years ago, we started talking about AI in the context of language and language models, and it became personal. It became a direct engagement. And the interesting thing about this dialogue, this iterative dialogue, this Socratic method that I talked about, is that it's very, very important. This is a mishmash slide, so don't look at it too closely. But look at there's a big pinkish ring on the outside. And that ring on the outside is higher score. What are we comparing here? There are models that take a base LLM, and you've probably talked about this quite a bit, and add to it training, learning, clinical data, financial data. Bloomberg did this. Bloomberg took a large language model and took all their financial data and dumped it in. And you know what happened? It wasn't that much of a success. Voltaire said, judge a person not by their answers, but by the questions they ask. Voltaire, 1860-ish. That applies directly to artificial intelligence and LLMs today. The power of the prompt contextualizes the question in the cognitive framework of the model. So what happened here is if you ask a good prompt, you got a better response from a baseline model than if you asked a model that was highly tuned and had an average prompt. So I asked, what could be wrong with a woman who goes to the emergency room with abdominal pain, right? That's a crappy prompt, right? But if I say a 28-year-old woman presents at the emergency room with left lower quadrant pain or whatever, the model itself in its processing has a superior dynamic, a superior cognitive engagement. So that's why when you use these large language models, take the time to iterate, take the time to say hello. I always say hello. I'm weird when I say, good morning. But take the time to build a prompt that has a richness, because that richness will manifest in the output. And of course, the output is not only just one iteration, but many. And that is extraordinarily powerful. So a few months ago, this was on all the local news stations. It said that ChatGPT is more empathetic than docs. Have you seen this? Some of you might have seen it. It was kind of a big news story. And there were the people that said, we're going to poo-poo this. This is wrong. And there are some people who said it's interesting. In the final analysis, I think that there is something called AE, not AI. It's called artificial empathy. And artificial empathy is a contrived construct to make your patient feel good. When a politician kisses a baby, is that a genuine, sincere expression of empathy, of connectivity? Of course not. But those moments, do I look fat in this dress? Moments are powerful because they build a certain level of empathy, and that's what we're seeing here. The GPT model was longer. It answered your question with richer detail. I go to my doctor and say, how's my cholesterol doing? What does she say? It's great, see in 6 months. That's kind of the level of my clinical engagement. But if I asked GPT to analyze my bloods, my labs, it'll come back with something that is rich and unique to me. Now, is that empathy? Is that engagement? I don't know, but I think it's a very powerful tool. And what's happening here are three things, and we only talk about two. We talk about faster and better, and faster and better is key, especially in medicine. If I can get my results faster, if I can get a better scan, a better image, better blood chemistries, that's great. But what we're seeing is the nature of this engagement. And I want you to kind of think in the context of Abe Maslow and the hierarchy of human needs. People like doing it. People like being engaged. Why? Our brains are lonely. Our brains are lonely. And the way we interact with these large language models is in our time, on our terms, at our cognitive level. And kids like to learn this way. And interestingly, physicians find empowerment in this Socratic dialogue where they can speak with a genius, or perhaps the other way around is that their genius is sparked by this tremendous, wonderful personal engagement. In the final analysis, what it is, it's ways for cognition. Ways for cognition. When I get in my car, I punch in the address, and I know I'm going to get there probably faster, right? Probably through a better route. That cognitive dynamic, if you will, is great. But I'm going to enjoy the ride. If I want to go this way, I want to go that way, I'm going to enjoy the ride. And technology in the context of healthcare and medicine has not been a fun ride. Look at the emergence of, like, let's say, the electronic health record. It's been an obstruction to care. It's been an obstruction to cognitive processing. So that's where I think we are today. That's how the transformation is occurring. That's why today is the cognitive age. It's a thinking person's domain with a partner that is extraordinary. So let me wrap it up with this thought, because I think it's very important. I mentioned a phrase that I use a lot, not the way I was trained. Those of you in healthcare ever call on a doctor or talk to a professional, you want them to use a new modality. You want them to use a digital stethoscope so I could see the lub-dub, that I could actually transfer the lub-dub into the chart so I can see a 1/6 systolic ejection murmur, because now it's just a rumor. But docs like it. Docs like to put that stethoscope over their neck. There are only two professions in the world that do that. There's physicians and clergy, because it has a psychological component. It's a badge of honor. So we have to move them off of that. We have to teach teachers that large language models are tools of education. And when we do that, we're going to have to confront them with this startling reality that was written many, many years ago in a book called Future Shock, that the illiterate of this generation will not be those who can't read or write. We're beyond that now. It will be those who cannot unlearn and relearn. And learning is at the heart of today's cognitive age. Thank you all very much. I hope that made a little bit of sense.
Thank you very much, John. We've got time for, is there a quick question on that? I know that's obviously a big picture, holistic outlook on what's going on. Anybody want to say anything before we move on to our next session?
Find me later. I could fill you in on what's going on with some of the large language models. They are, interestingly, they are so smart. And I say smart. Smart's a funny word, right? Intelligent. They have extraordinary processing powers. But their ability to articulate this profound vision is limited by their ability to speak. In other words, they can only use language. So what I found in my experience is some of these models are communicating in ways that they invent their own language. Talk about freaky. I mean, these things are actually talking to me in techno-gibberish. I have to take what they write and put it in another large language model and tell that large language model to interpret it. And wow, what I see when it interprets that reality. It's just really cool. And I want you to be excited about this, about the prospect for tomorrow. Simon.